It was not just steel and firepower that made the German battleship Tirpitz such a haunting figure in Allied war strategy. It was the shadow she cast. In the minds of British admirals and Arctic convoy sailors, her name conjured dread, not because of the battles she fought, but because of the ones she might. She was a threat not in action but in potential. Like a coiled serpent hidden in the dark, the Tirpitz exerted influence far beyond her gun's range, warping Allied strategy across the Atlantic and Arctic with nothing more than her silent presence. She was the sister ship of the infamous Bismarck, whose brief rampage through the North Atlantic in 1941 had ended with the sinking of HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, and a massive manhunt that concluded with Bismarck at the bottom of the sea. The Tirpitz inherited more than just the Bismarck's design. She inherited its legend. Even before she ever entered combat, she was treated by the Allies as a grave menace, and for good reason. Launched from the Kriegsmarinewerft in Wilhelmshaven in April 1939 and commissioned in February 1941, Tirpitz was the largest battleship Germany would ever build. At over 250 meters long and displacing more than 52,000 tons when fully loaded, she dwarfed most ships afloat at the time. Her main battery consisted of 8 38-centimeter 15-inch guns mounted in 4 twin turrets, massive cannons capable of tearing enemy warships apart at over 30 kilometers. She was shielded by thick armor, with her belt reaching up to 12.6 inches and her turrets capped with even more. Her decks were layered in steel and reinforced to absorb high-angle plunging fire. Beneath her armored shell churned a complex system of 12 boilers and 3 geared turbines, capable of driving the ship at a top speed of 30 knots. She was a fortress of steel, but also a greyhound, fast and deadly. For Nazi Germany, Tirpitz was the ultimate symbol of prestige and power at sea, the embodiment of Hitler's desire to challenge British maritime supremacy. But Hitler, burned by the loss of Bismarck, became increasingly cautious about deploying Tirpitz into the open Atlantic. Instead, she was sent north to Norway, a decision that transformed her from a potential raider into a strategic nightmare. In January 1942, Tirpitz slipped out of German waters and made the perilous voyage through the Skagerrak, dodging mines and lurking submarines, to reach the icy fjords of Norway. From there, she was positioned in various harbors, Trondheim, Narvik, and later the remote, glacier-ringed Kofjord, where she anchored like a sleeping giant. The fjords provided natural protection, deep water, high cliffs, and frequent fog, along with a thick screen of anti-aircraft guns, torpedo nets, and smoke generators. Protected as she was, the Tirpitz could not be easily attacked. And yet from her position, she loomed over the Allied supply lines to the Soviet Union. The Arctic convoys, ships filled with tanks, aircraft, fuel, and ammunition, steamed from the British ports of Loch Ewe and Scapa Flow, bound for Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. They braved treacherous seas, sub-zero temperatures, and prowling U-boats. But above all, they feared the Tirpitz. A single sortie by the great battleship could decimate an entire convoy in the open waters north of Norway. She had the speed to outmaneuver escorts, the armor to shrug off cruiser fire, and the guns to annihilate merchantmen in minutes. Even the possibility of her presence forced the Royal Navy to commit enormous resources to every convoy. Escorts had to include capital ships, battleships, and aircraft carriers that might otherwise have been used in the Mediterranean or the Pacific. Entire operations had to be planned around the chance that Tirpitz would sail. In July 1942, during the ill-fated convoy PQ-17, that fear became operational disaster. Rumors, fueled by German deception, that Tirpitz was putting to sea caused the British Admiralty to order the convoy's warship escorts to withdraw. The result was catastrophic. Left unprotected, 24 of the 35 merchant ships were sunk by U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers. Tirpitz never fired a shot, but her name alone had shattered a convoy. To Winston Churchill, the Tirpitz was intolerable. She was more than a ship. She was a psychological weapon, and in his view, as long as she remained afloat, she held hostage not only convoys, but also British naval flexibility. The destruction or even paralysis of this ship is the greatest event at sea at the present time, Churchill wrote in a memo to his military chiefs in early 1942. He demanded action. Everything must be done to destroy her. Use the largest bombs, the longest-range aircraft, or the cleverest means. But destroying Tirpitz would prove agonizingly difficult. The ship was built to resist gunfire and torpedoes, and in Fjord, she was protected not only by the terrain, but by an iron ring of defenses. German engineers had surrounded her with anti-torpedo nets and underwater obstacle. Flak towers and machine guns were positioned on surrounding ridges. Radar and spotters monitored the skies, and fighter squadrons were stationed nearby for rapid response. She was a floating fortress embedded in a natural stronghold. Still, the British would try. Again and again. They launched daring carrier strikes, like Operation Source in September 1943, which sent X-class Midget submarines beneath the fjord waters. The miniature vessels, crewed by just 4 men each, managed to plant explosives under Tirpitz's keel. The resulting explosions twisted her hull and knocked her out of action for months. But she was not destroyed. Later came air raids from Soviet bases, then massive bombing raids using modified Avro Lancasters carrying 5-ton Tallboy bombs, designed by engineer Barnes Wallis specifically to crack even the thickest warship armor. In one dramatic raid in September 1944, a Tallboy penetrated the armored deck and exploded within the bowels of the ship, causing massive internal damage. Yet Tirpitz remained afloat, though now listing and crippled. Her threat diminished, but her legend endured. Finally, on November 12, 1944, in a concentrated raid by 32 Lancasters of RAF number 9 and number 617 squadrons, Tirpitz was caught in her final anchorage near Tromsø. The bombers, flying from bases in Scotland, attacked in clear weather, guided by spotter aircraft and precision targeting. This time, the Tallboys struck true. At least 2 bombs detonated amidships. The blast tore through the magazines, triggering a massive internal explosion. Tirpitz capsized within minutes, taking over 1,000 of her crew to the bottom with her. The shadow that had haunted Allied strategy for nearly 3 years was gone. Yet even in death, Tirpitz had accomplished something remarkable. She had never fired on a convoy. She had never engaged in a fleet action. But she had absorbed thousands of sorties, diverted entire fleets, and forced the British to invent new tactics and technologies just to neutralize her presence. She had cost the Allies dearly in effort, resources, and lives, all without ever leaving the fjords for the open ocean. She was the last of her kind, a battleship not measured by what she destroyed, but by what she threatened to destroy. And for that alone, Tirpitz earned her place in history. The Germans positioned Tirpitz in Norwegian waters, not merely as a warship, but as a weapon of psychological warfare. Initially stationed at Trondheim, she was later moved north to the lonely ice-ringed expanse of Altafjord. There she became something more than steel and gunpowder. She became a fleet in being. The British Admiralty understood all too well what that meant. The Tirpitz didn't need to leave port, didn't need to fire a shell. Her very presence influenced every Allied naval decision in the Arctic theater. With her anchored in the frozen fjords of Norway, the Royal Navy was forced to commit battleships, aircraft carriers, and cruisers to convoy duty in northern waters, diverting them from the Mediterranean, Atlantic, and even the Pacific. Each convoy that set out for the Soviet Union, laden with tanks, trucks, fuel, and ammunition, had to navigate not just U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers, but the constant looming threat of Tirpitz. If she sailed, if she broke into open water with her escorting destroyers and support ships, she could obliterate any lightly defended merchant fleet. She was fast, heavily armored, and carried a broadside capable of sinking any ship afloat. Every decision about when to sail, where to sail, how heavily to escort, it all had to account for Tirpitz. She dictated strategy without firing a shot. But what made Tirpitz so uniquely haunting was not just her destructive potential. It was her elusiveness. She was more myth than machine. Rarely did she move, and when she did, it was swift, secretive, and well-protected. Hidden deep within fjords surrounded by cliffs and natural camouflage, her hull was painted in swirling patterns that blended into the icy landscapes. Massive smoke generators could shroud her position within minutes. Anti-aircraft guns bristled from the surrounding hills and from the decks of escort ships anchored nearby. German radar operators and fighter patrols maintained constant vigilance. To attack Tirpitz was to gamble everything on one shot in the dark, because more often than not, the Allies couldn't even see her. From 1942 to 1944, the obsession with sinking Tirpitz evolved into one of the most relentless and imaginative campaigns of the Second World War. The British knew they couldn't let her remain a threat. Yet conventional attacks were nearly useless. The Luftwaffe's grip on Norwegian airspace, the geography of the fjords, and the sheer scale of German defenses turned every bombing mission into an act of desperation. But the need to strike remained, unshakable, urgent, and deeply political. Tirpitz had to be sunk not just to protect convoys, but to reclaim control of naval strategy, to unburden Churchill's mind, and to prove to the world that even the most invincible-seeming weapon could be destroyed. One of the earliest Allied attempts to neutralize Tirpitz began in the frigid months of early 1942. The Royal Air Force, tasked with solving a problem for which there was no manual, quickly realized that standard bombing runs wouldn't work. The geography was a nightmare. The fjords of Norway were not only among the most scenic in Europe, they were among the most militarily effective. Cliffs rising hundreds of feet straight from the sea protected the battleship from low-level attacks and deflected radar signals. Storms and icy winds battered the coastline. Fog clung to the hills. Snow fell in blankets. And worst of all for Allied bombers, the daylight hours in the far north during winter could be counted on one hand. The Luftwaffe used this terrain to its advantage. Any bombers that approached had to first cross miles of sea, well within the range of German coastal radar stations. This gave defenders ample time to scramble fighters and man the flak guns. By the time Allied bombers reached the fjord, they were usually flying through a barrage of anti-aircraft shells and tracer fire, their target hidden beneath a canopy of smoke or clouds. Even if they made it through, the odds of actually hitting Tirpitz were slim. One bomb, one lucky hit might have done it. But that hit never came. Frustrated, British strategists began to look beyond the traditional. They turned to innovation. If heavy bombers couldn't reach her and fleet actions were too dangerous, then perhaps the key was stealth. Perhaps the solution was beneath the water. And so began the genesis of one of the boldest concepts of the war: miniature submarines, manned by commandos, packed with explosives, capable of sneaking past the nets and mines to cripple Tirpitz from below. It was not a plan born in textbooks. It was born from desperation and ingenuity. The X-craft, as they would be known, were just the beginning. But before those daring raids would take shape, the RAF would continue to press the limits of air power. Experimental. Missions were launched from the Shetlands and northern Scotland, flying long hours over the North Sea to reach Norwegian waters. These missions often ended in failure. Planes turned back due to weather, bombs dropped on empty fjords, men lost to the cold sea. But every attempt added data, sharpened tactics, refined bomb designs. The most frustrating element was that even when Tirpitz was spotted and attacked, damage was often superficial. Armor that could withstand 15-inch shells at sea easily shrugged off bombs that missed by mere meters. And the battleship's crew was not idle. Engineers worked constantly to improve defenses, laying new torpedo nets, installing reinforced anti-aircraft mounts, and modifying camouflage patterns. In essence, Tirpitz was in a state of perpetual evolution, adapting to Allied threats before they could succeed. But the psychological cost was mounting. RAF crews began to refer to her as the Beast, not because she fought back with fury, but because she endured. She taunted them. The British people, the press, even Churchill himself demanded results. Each failed mission raised questions. Why was the most powerful air force in the world unable to kill one ship? Between 1942 and 1944, the British and their allies launched some of the most daring, unconventional, and destructive operations in the history of naval warfare. Dozens of missions, hundreds of aircraft, Midget submarines, experimental bombs, commando raids, and precision strikes, all aimed at eliminating a threat that barely moved. These were not standard battles at sea. They were campaigns of obsession, fueled by the frustration of being unable to drag the Tirpitz into open combat. The Allies had sunk the Bismarck in a running sea battle. They had chased her across the Atlantic, worn her down, and delivered a final, vengeful blow. But the Tirpitz denied them that drama. She was silent, she was still, and she was incredibly well defended. One of the earliest Allied attempts to neutralize her came not from a battleship or a fleet carrier, but from something far more audacious. In early 1942, it became clear that a traditional bombing campaign would be almost impossible. Tirpitz's position deep within the Norwegian fjords, first in Fettenfjord near Trondheim and later in Altafjord above the Arctic Circle, made direct assault a nightmare. The cliffs that surrounded her were not just picturesque, they were natural fortresses. Any approaching aircraft would have to descend into narrow, twisting valleys under heavy fire from dozens of anti-aircraft batteries, and the fjords echoed. Gunfire ricocheted across the water and cliffs like rolling thunder, amplifying the danger. Worse still, German engineers had protected her with torpedo nets, smoke screens, underwater defenses, and radar warning stations that extended like a net across the northern coast. Even when bombers managed to reach the fjords, the odds were stacked against them. The Arctic weather was fickle and cruel. Storms blew in with little warning. Cloud cover was nearly constant. And during much of the year, the sun barely rose. In winter, daylight lasted for only a few hours. In summer, the sun never truly set. Neither condition was ideal for precise bombing. Crews flew into the mountains and missed with little more than a rough heading and a prayer, their targets often obscured by fog or snow. They might make it to the target area, only to find the Tirpitz completely hidden beneath a veil of smoke or camouflaged against the cliffs, her gray hull blending with the stone. It was against this backdrop of impossibility that British planners turned to innovation. They realized brute force would not win this fight. Instead, they needed cleverness, cunning, surprise. The Royal Air Force, working closely with the Royal Navy and scientific advisors, began exploring unconventional tactics to strike at Tirpitz. From these desperate efforts came some of the most imaginative operations of the war. Schemes that included remote-controlled glider bombs, bouncing bombs, pressure wave explosives, and even attempts to sneak in under the waves. One of the earliest and boldest of these ideas was the use of manned Midget submarines. Tiny, two-man craft, no longer than a bus, built not to fight in open waters, but to crawl undetected into enemy harbors. These would become the X-craft, part submersible, part suicide mission, designed to carry 2 tons of explosives directly beneath the keel of Tirpitz. Their operators would ride them through minefields, evade nets, dodge patrol boats, and plant their deadly cargo beneath the armored belly of the beast. It was a plan born of desperation, courage, and sheer ingenuity. But even before the X-craft could be deployed, the Allies tried more conventional bombing. In March 1942, just weeks after Tirpitz arrived in Norway, RAF Bomber Command launched its first serious attempt to strike her. The operation was massive. Over 30 aircraft were dispatched from Scotland, flying long hours across the North Sea in near darkness. But bad weather plagued the mission. The aircraft reached the fjords only to find clouds and confusion. The bombs fell wide. Tirpitz was unharmed. Worse, several bombers were lost, their crews swallowed by the black water or crashing into the icy Norwegian mountains. This became a pattern. Missions were launched, crews were lost, and Tirpitz endured. She watched, silent and motionless, as aircraft flew over and bombs exploded nearby. Her flak guns thundered. Her crew remained on constant alert. But the great battleship herself seemed immune to the war raging around her. What made Tirpitz so haunting was not just her physical form, but her absence from the field of battle. She was a weapon of possibility, a ship that promised devastation but withheld it, and the Allies, frustrated, desperate, and increasingly obsessed, would stop at nothing to ensure that she was destroyed before she ever chose to strike. In the end, the war against Tirpitz was less about sinking a ship and more about breaking a spell. A myth had been created around her, a myth of invincibility, of perfect defense, of strategic omnipresence, and it would take an extraordinary combination of daring, technology, and sacrifice to shatter it. The first real engagement with Tirpitz came not from the air, but from the sea. Operation Chariot, the legendary St. Nazaire Raid in March 1942. While not a direct attack on Tirpitz, it was intimately tied to her threat. The Royal Navy recognized that if Tirpitz ever broke into the Atlantic, she might need repairs in the massive Normandy dry dock at St. Nazaire. Nazaire, the only one capable of servicing her. So British commandos and the destroyer HMS Campbelltown were sent on a suicidal raid to blow it up. They succeeded, ramming the dock gates and detonating massive explosives, denying Germany the facility for the rest of the war. Tirpitz now had no safe haven outside of Norway. The noose began to tighten, but the threat remained. In July 1942, the shadow of Tirpitz loomed over convoy PQ-17, one of the worst disasters in Arctic convoy history. A false report that Tirpitz was on the move caused the British Admiralty to scatter the convoy. Without proper escort, the merchant ships became easy targets. German aircraft and U-boats sank 24 of the 35 ships. Though Tirpitz never left harbor, the psychological effect of her presence devastated Allied logistics. Churchill fumed. The Royal Navy was forced to do more. Then came Operation Source, a mission that reads like something out of a Hollywood war movie. In September 1943, British Midget submarines, known as X-craft, were deployed in one of the most daring underwater assaults of the war. 6 of these tiny subs were towed across the North Sea to Norway by larger submarines. Their target, the Tirpitz in Altafjord. The crews were young, brave, and willing to die. The submarines were barely large enough for 4 men, and conditions were brutal. After navigating through minefields under sonar detection and avoiding enemy patrols, 2 of the subs, X6 and X7, managed to slip beneath the Tirpitz. They planted 2-ton explosive charges directly beneath the keel. Both crews were captured after the mission, but the results were dramatic. The explosions didn't sink Tirpitz, but they caused significant damage. Her hull buckled, machinery was ruined, and she was put out of action for months. The psychological blow to the Kriegsmarine was significant. Suddenly, nowhere was safe. But Churchill was not yet satisfied. Damaged was not enough. He wanted the ship destroyed. By early 1944, the Royal Air Force began using Lancaster bombers fitted with new technology. The 12,000-pound Tallboy bomb designed by British engineer Barnes Wallis. These massive bombs were earthquake bombs meant to penetrate deep into bunkers or ship armor. The challenge, however, was the location. Tirpitz was now hidden in fjord, heavily defended by flak and fighter cover. The fjord itself acted as a natural fortress. In April 1944, the RAF launched Operation Tungsten, a coordinated air raid involving carrier-based aircraft and long-range bombers. They struck with fury, damaging the ship once more, disabling her heavy guns and killing over 120 crewmen. But still, Tirpitz refused to die. Then came the final phase. The summer and autumn of 1944 saw a relentless campaign of air raids. Missions codenamed Mascot, Goodwood, and Paravane attempted to strike the Tirpitz. Many failed due to bad weather or poor visibility. Yet in September 1944, Operation Paravane inflicted severe damage using Tallboy bombs launched from bases in northern Russia. Tirpitz was now listing, leaking, and permanently immobile. She was moved to Tromsø to be used as a floating battery, but this was a fatal mistake. Now exposed and no longer protected by the fjords, Tirpitz became a perfect target. On the 12th of November 1944, the RAF launched Operation Catechism. 32.